This meeting is being recorded.
Hey guys, thanks for joining. We'll give it a minute and then we'll get started. Hey, Becky, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Okay, cool. I got that old test your speaker prompt when I signed on, so. Okay, I am, whoops, hang on. There we go. All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. So today's session, I thought I would do a little training on commercial leasing. And for those of you that ever wanted to get into commercial real estate, I think you're really going to like this class. I've had quite a bit of experience in this area, and it's going to be fun. Well, I'll kind of tell some stories and kind of give you the overview of what it means to be in commercial real estate. And we'll go over some of the forms that we'll use. And I think this will give you a good introduction into what this is all about. So before I get started, a commercial realtor is really not referred to as a commercial realtor. They are called commercial practitioners. So if anybody hears that expression, that is typically how commercial real estate agents are referred to. Secondly, if you do find that this is something that kind of piques your interest, the next step would be to go take a class from one of any of your local boards or another, preferably live class about commercial leasing. There is a lady out of Houston that does a very, very good job at this. And she has a website called commercialleasing101.com. And her name is Mish Guillory. And while she has her own commercial business and her own commercial/real estate school, she does do a lot of these classes through HAR. You do not need to be a member of HAR to take the class. But if you are looking for an expert and someone that delivers the material in a very understandable way, Mish is the person, okay? Next, for most commercial practitioners, if they do any leasing, they know that this is the bread and butter of their business. And so these big high profile deals where XYZ commercial practitioner represented XYZ company to buy a $5 billion business or a $3 million high-rise building, that is not, those are few and far between. And so think of how many strip centers there are in Texas, and you will soon realize that to do even a small amount of commercial leasing business can be very profitable. The last thing I want to impart before we move on, I want to plant a thought in your mind. While this country, and I don't know about the economics of any other country but the US. So, and from personal experience, contrary to what the language is typically around starting a new business in the United States of America, we are the land of opportunity. This country does not make it very easy to succeed as a small business. And I'm going to go into some reasons why, just in the leasing part of the equation. So the idea I want to plant in your head today is that whenever we're driving past a vacant strip center and we start to see that thing fill up, we always look at it from the standpoint of the consumer. What's going in there? How is that going to benefit me? Oh gosh, another nail salon, right? But you'll find out through this teaching today that just to get to a point from a small business perspective, to get to put that sign on the front of that building took a tremendous amount of sacrifice, struggle, and financial know-how. Secondarily, whenever you see a business leave, that is someone's dream that kind of, went up in smoke. And, COVID, we saw a lot of that, right? But starting a business and folding a business is not for the faint of heart. And so I want you to think about that whenever you see a new business coming or going, with regards to what behind the scenes is really going on. All right, so with that being said, let's kind of launch into this. So what are the differences between a residential lease and a commercial lease? Well, the residential, a landlord pretty much fixes everything, right? AC breaks, call the landlord. Loose faucet, call the landlord. The lease term is typically a lot shorter, right? We're dealing with 1-year leases, typically no more than 2 years. The tenant, there is no, overall personal guarantee of that lease. Now, there isn't commercial, and I'll explain that in a second in terms of what that means. But you still are bound by the lease in residential, but there's no overarching plan B in case the lease goes south. Location for where you live is not as important as a commercial lease, right? So if you're opening up a business, you want to make sure that that business's location is such that it maximizes traffic to that space, okay? Rent for residential is pretty much market-based only, which means that if a 3-2 two-car garage is going for $2,000 in that neighborhood, then that's pretty much going to be what the rent is. It's not based on anything else. And the realtor is compensated in pretty much a traditional way. It's either 1 month or 50% of 1 month of the rent. Talk about commercial. If you rent a commercial space, and so think of in your mind's eye a strip center, okay? The landlord fixes nothing. So that is up to the business owner to fix. Okay, so typically you have, just as one example, your lighting. It's LED lighting for the most part, and that is oftentimes dictated by the town code. You can't just have any lighting in there. And if one of those things blows out, or if you walk into whatever and you see the light flickering, the reason why sometimes it flickers for weeks and months on end is because that's about $150 to fix one of those things. And so if you've got 25, 35 lights in one commercial space and 2 go out at one time, that is an expense, okay? And that is something that the landlord will not fix. You're usually talking about a 5-year lease minimum, okay? because typically a business is not going to jump from location to location. That makes no sense at all. You spend all this time and effort to market that your business is in XYZ location. You want to make sure that you stay there. Okay, and so the lease is usually for a 5-year term minimum. The business owner does personally guarantee the rent for the entire term. What does this mean? If you think as a business owner, you can put the lease under the business name, which is typically what you'll do. And if that business goes under at year 2, that you can just walk away and not be on the hook for that rent, you are mistaken. That is not the way a lease is written in the commercial world. The owner is typically personally on the hook for the lease term. Okay. If you see all of a sudden a business just all of a sudden shut down, and you go in to get whatever that day and the doors are locked and they've gone out of business, people do that and they abandon their lease, but that is going to negatively impact that owner's credit. That is not what you want to do. All right, and then location is critical. As I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that people know where you are as a small business. Okay, and then rent, and we're going to get into the mathematical equation of this in a second, but rent is based on the square footage of that space. So if you're renting out a 2,400 square foot space, it's going to be multiplied by a per square foot amount. The better the location, the higher that amount will be. However, then you get into an equation where you're also covering the owner's taxes, insurance, and the amount of money it takes to keep up the grounds of where that commercial space is. We call that triple net, and I'll get into that more in a moment. But if you have a client that wants to go get a commercial space and open up their, dream bakery because they have a box full of grandma's pie recipes, and this has been their lifelong dream to not work for the man anymore, oftentimes they don't realize that it's not just the per square foot amount that they have to account for. It's these triple nets that add on to the rent that you're going to have to cover. Okay, and then you as the realtor are compensated based on the lease term. So let's just, I'm going to go into that in a second. So what is it that the client is actually renting? You're literally renting the airspace between the 4 walls, the roof, and the ceiling. You own nothing. Okay, and this is one of many points that fall under the umbrella of it's very difficult for a small business owner to get up and running because you don't own anything. And because the landlord won't cover anything, you as the business owner really behave as if you do own that space, because the landlord ain't paying for nothing unless the foundation cracks or the roof is hit by a hailstorm. That is it. Okay. So my next point here is tenant is responsible for everything associated with conducting business in that space, including all repairs, your HVAC, both maintenance and install. So if that space doesn't have an HVAC system, you're putting one in, and that's about $30,000 or $40,000. Right? You are paying for personal property tax. This is my personal favorite. This is point 2, whereby the laws in this country make it difficult. Here's what I discovered, and some of my stories will relate to when I had a physical real estate office recently, closed it down last September. I did not realize that the tax man came a-calling once a year from the county and said, "Oh, you're a business owner here? You have to pay taxes." On what? What are my triple nets for? That's the landlord's responsibility. Oh no. You see these desks? and these chairs and all the artwork on the wall, that gets taxed. So I was lucky because I didn't have a whole lot of extra stuff other than what I just mentioned. But restaurants, bars, any grocery stores, they're paying taxes on everything within those four walls. For me, it amounted to about $90 a year. It was the check I liked to write the least because it was just so enraging to me that I had to pay taxes on my own stuff every year. Okay, so think about that as you acquire commercial clients. That is going to be a component. Next,
Brad, also, yep. it also, not just the four walls, it's whatever vehicles are kept there as well. Mm-hmm. So if there are commercial vehicles, we have a commercial property, and we were lucky to avoid that for several years. And then when they found us, So whatever vehicles are parked there, you have to make sure that if they're not yours, because sometimes we had subcontractors parking their vehicles there, that there was some distinction for the county to know that that's not yours. So anyway, just thought I'd throw that in.
That's a wonderful point. I did not know that. That's a great point. Yep. And not to mention the insurance coverage that has to come along with all of that. So lastly, as I mentioned earlier, you are also covering your portion of the taxes, the insurance, and the common area maintenance cost, often referred to as CAM, for your space. Now, let's say the entire strip center, and I'm going to mention strip centers a lot because it's the most common commercial asset that is out there. Let's say the commercial strip center is 100,000 square feet and there's 25 spaces. If you only represent 2,400 square feet, you're only paying 2,400 square feet's worth of taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance. Here's the bad news. Taxes go up, insurance goes up, and unless that management company is judicious about keeping those costs low on the maintenance crew that maintains the area, those could go up too. Okay, quick story. Moved into my office in 2017. Didn't know this, but the owner had aspirations of selling the thing. So he leased it up and promised me the moon and delivered, but he wasn't collecting what I should have been paying in these three areas. He sells it, new management company takes over and says, guess what? Not only do you have to pay extra each month to catch us up, when that happens and the catch up is done, your rent is going to go up by X amount. My rent went up $1,000 a month. It was almost a deal breaker. It was almost a deal breaker. So that being said, these costs can go up just like it does in residential. Your taxes go up, your insurance could go up, and so on. But that is something that a tenant does not understand. If you get a commercial lease tenant, they are so blinded by getting into the space and starting their business that they don't think about these things. Now, if you are hesitant about getting into the commercial space, I get it, but it is not unlike any other aspect in real estate in that if you know the right questions to ask so that it covers you and covers your client, then you're going to be fine. But right now, you probably don't know what those questions are. Okay, so don't be intimidated. So let's just get right to the heart of the matter. We all want to know what we as realtors can be compensated on. So let's go back. There is going to be a base rent, and then there's going to be those triple nets, right? We are not compensated on triple nets. We are compensated on the raw rent that is being paid to the landlord. Industry standard is that is going to be about 4% of the monthly rent, base rent, multiplied by the entire lease term. So as an example, if the monthly base rent is $6,000, now they're going to pay more than that based on triple nets, right? But $6,000, it's a 5-year term. That's $360,000. You're going to get 4% of that, or $14,400. Typically, half is paid at signing, half is paid at move-in. If they're not going to move in for 3 or 4 months, you're not going to get that other half for 3 or 4 months. Okay, here's the bad news. The bad news is that commercial leasing, when it comes to realtor compensation, is kind of loosey-goosey. It can make you feel a little unsettled because it's not written down anywhere. There is no commercial MLS that says, this is your compensation. That's why I'm telling you that as an industry standard, it is typically 4%. You're going to want to get that in writing, and I'm going to show you how to do that later on in the presentation. Okay, so yeah, not posted anywhere, so there you go. All right, so commercial spaces, what kind are there? Typically, you're talking about a strip center, an office condo, warehouse space, or a high rise. Here's your typical strip center. Okay, we've got a Japanese restaurant, looks like a pet supply place, Subway, and I can't make out what those other businesses are. But all these businesses sell something. And I want to plant another idea in your head. In Texas, on any 4 corners, you're going to find 4 nail salons, 4 donut shops, 4 dry cleaners. It takes a lot of donuts to make up the rent. I just want you to be aware of that. And typically, clients that come to you that have not ever done this before have no earthly idea what it takes to run this business and to make sure that they're going to cover at least the rent, not even including the insurance, the flour, butter, sugar it takes to make the donuts. They have no idea how the shop should be configured, and we're going to get into that in a moment. But there are so many unknowns that a potential commercial client will bring to you that you're probably going to have to send them back and do some homework. Okay, this is an office condo, so just eyeballing this, it looks like it has 3 separate offices, and so all told, maybe it's got 8. There's 2 on the other side, 2 on the end. So 8 told. There's typically 3, 4, 5 of these buildings, and they can be configured in a variety of ways. But this is an office condo. Usually, triple nets are not included in an office condo scenario. That is usually reserved for strip centers. Warehouse, we've all seen them, right? A lot of times they want 90% warehouse space, 10% offices. You're going to need a bathroom in there, but it's kind of rugged. Location isn't as big a deal because they're not typically looking at clients. Okay, triple nets are not usually a factor here either, but this, and then this is of course a high rise. There's other factors to consider here, such as signage, HVAC, usage, and so on. We're going to get into that when we look at the lease. So, what will a landlord want from a tenant? They're going to want 2 years or more of financials. They're going to want to know that this business is viable. Now, are there plenty of startup companies? You bet. Are landlords letting them in? You bet. So, but traditionally, they're going to want to know a tenant's ability to cover that rent. So they either need a viable, growing, thriving business now, or they need some kind of cash reserve to prove that they can cover the rent. Now, when I moved in, it was a RE/MAX franchise. So that went a ways. I had never done this before in a commercial space. And I had some cash reserves, but they're more likely to accept a franchisee than they are a mom and pop. They're going to want to understand what kind of business it is. Is it going to be a church? And I've represented a church before. You know, what does that mean for parking? That means that on Sunday mornings, there's going to be 150 people there, but every other day of the week, there's not. Is it going to be a hookah lounge? Hookah lounge only operates from usually 5 p.m. to 2 in the morning. Are you only doing hookah, or is there music? Is there a propensity for stuff to get out of hand? You know, I mean, these are all going to be considerations. Just because there's vacant space doesn't mean your tenant is going to be granted a lease. Can the owner personally guarantee the rent for the lease term? So if this business goes belly up in year 2 of a 5-year lease, it is not easy to get out of these leases, you guys. It is not. So they're going to look for a personal guarantee. What will the tenant be doing with the space? Is there going to be alcohol served? Is there going to be a business that's going to have a propensity for loitering? You know, stuff like that. Is going to be a tire center, whatever. You know, is there going to be hazardous waste on the property? Are there parking considerations? Again, going back to the church example. Is there not just going to be, I mean, is there just going to not be enough parking? Okay. So questions for you to ask before looking. Do you have, Mr. or Mrs. Client, the cash reserves to cover the rent during slow revenue cycles? So whenever and I don't do many of these a year because I just don't have time, but whenever I do enter into a discussion with a commercial client, I always assume they've never thought of these things before. And so some of these questions might seem basic, but I can guarantee that 9 out of 10 of these folks have never considered these things before. So do you have the cash to cover the rent during low revenue cycles? How long is it going to take you to get up and running? Okay, how much space do you need? I mean, do they know the difference between 2,000 square feet and 2,500 square feet? What's your budget? How's that space going to be configured? Their budget normally is far less than what the market rents are. Okay, and that's when the rubber meets the road. How many donuts are you going to need to sell to make it to your budget? And when I entered into this equation, I thought, generally speaking, I could probably afford $5,000 to $6,000 a month, you know, and boy, was I wrong. But that's a story for another time. But then I had to realize, okay, well, if I don't get any realtors or have any income coming in, how many months can I last? And I had about 3 or 4 months reserved. Typically, whatever you have is not enough. It's got to be 6, 8, 9 months, because there are going to be unexpected expenses that come up. Okay. Do you want a shell or a second generation space? Let's talk about that for a second. I don't have visuals and I don't have anything else in the presentation that speaks to this. What is a shell space? A shell space is when you go up to a strip center that was just built and you peek inside and all you see is a cement slab and metal studs, and maybe some insulation, typically not. Okay, there might be a hole in the ceiling where an HVAC unit goes, but there is nothing other than plumbing underneath the slab. That is it. So the tenant is then responsible for building out that space as they see fit. Will the landlord let you do this? Absolutely. Do you get to take any of that stuff with you when your business leaves? Absolutely not. Okay. Versus second generation space, which is you're moving into a commercial space that's already been built out for something. So if you are a brand new dentist, you will likely be able to find a space that was once configured for a dental office. Maybe you do a couple of small modifications, maybe not. But that is what's known as second generation space. Okay. It might be a little bit more expensive because it's already plug and play. But if you choose a shell space, the good news is you get to configure it how you want. The bad news is it's expensive. The other bad news is it takes time and you're not going to be open for a while. Okay. So did you know that if you do go into what's called the shell space, the landlord may help you out in contributing financially to that build out? Okay, that is sometimes and typically what will happen. However, and that's what happened with me. It was a $100,000 price tag. I wrote a check for 50 and the landlord ponied up the other 50. However, I had to front the money for the entire project and then get reimbursed. That is an important distinction to make. So they call those tenant improvements or TI allowances. Okay, so the landlord may contribute, but it will not be until that project is done and paid for by the tenant. Okay, but just know that going in, if your client wants to build something out, you as the realtor negotiate with the landlord how much, if any, they're going to contribute. All right. And then, Mr. and Mrs. Tenant, what is your location preference? This is elementary. And it is more important than wanting a place to live, finding a place to live, because location is everything in a business. So we can give them what's available, but until we know where they want to be, we're not going to be able to help them. And only they will know that. Okay, because if they're going to open up a karate studio, which is, again, you can find in any four corners in Texas, they don't want to be next door to another martial arts studio. And so that is not our job to figure out. That's the tenant's job. Okay, that is part of their business plan. And if they're going to go get a loan to do any of this, the bank is sure going to want to know what that looks like. So that is not our job. Okay, so that is yet another question to ask the tenant. Do you have architectural plans? This is a big deal. Whether or not it's a shell or a second gen space, the owner has to know how that space is going to flow. Now, if they are going to open up a restaurant, I sure hope that they've done this before. And if so, they're going to know what the normal flow is. And however, it is best if they have an architectural layout as to what that looks like. So here's what I did. I wrote in my own, silo and my limited knowledge of where stuff should be on a blank sheet of paper. I took it to an architect and had them draft up, the plans that they draft up that are, compliant with what a builder's going to want to see, what the town is going to want to see, and so on. But is there an expense incurred with that? Yes, there is. But it's well worth it because you can use those plans over and over and over again, and it helps the tenant visualize how that space is going to be used. Okay, so if they don't, they're going to make a ton of mistakes and they're going to waste a lot of your time. Okay, so here's the general process. So the client and the realtor look for space based on location and price. You can use applications like LoopNet and Crexy to help you with your search. Commercial agents won't be in the MLS. Okay, there will be some commercial listings in the MLS, but that's not where a lot of these will be. You do not need a subscription to LoopNet or Crexy as a leasing agent to find listings. You will also sometimes uncover listings that are not in these software systems. And that's where your tenant can help you kind of ferret out a listing or a location that is ideal for them, but maybe there's just a sign in the window that says, hey, call XYZ management company. That's going to be common, by the way. Okay. But if they're in LoopNet or Crexy, you will get to see what the rate is, per square foot and all that good stuff. Okay, the realtor will have to call the listing company to get access. their realtor will likely not be there. Okay, they don't want to be bothered. The keys are usually in a lockbox somewhere. You're given the combo. You lock up when you're done. Many times the utilities are off, so make sure you go during the day when the light is optimal. Also, if you are looking at 6 spaces, narrow it down to the 2 or 3 that the tenant wants to go see and bring as many people as you can to those spots, i.e. Contractors, architects, so on, to make sure that you're not wasting people's time. You don't want to keep having to go back to that space over and over and over again. Okay, commercial listing agents don't like that. Okay. Other commercial agents will likely not be very responsive. You will have to call them over and over and over again because they get a lot of people that pull up to a vacant space and call the number on the sign, and they have no intention of renting. They're not qualified to rent, and they're not represented. Okay, so they want to really make sure that your client is serious. They also tend to be very business-like. They are not emotionally driven. So get out of your mind that you're going to write some letter that says this is going to be ideal for my client's donut shop. They don't care. Okay. It's just matter of fact, which really gives you permission to get matter of fact right back. Okay. Not rude, not aggressive, just all business. So the offer process. So you're going to present a letter of intent or LOI. This is not a binding agreement, but it should reflect about 90% of what the tenant wants. We're going to review one in a moment. The landlord is going to review this, and they are going to counter or cross out and write in what they want. So let's say your tenant wants a 3-year term. That's not going to fly. The landlord counters back and says, no, it's a 5-year term. And you can go back as many times as you want, but the final iteration should be reflective of what that contract is going to say. Or the lease, there is no contract, it's lease. Okay, once the LOI is finalized, landlord will typically draft up the lease. You will not do it, but we are going to go through one just to give you guys a flavor of what to ask and what to look for. So what can you negotiate? Tenant improvements or the build out, right? How much is the landlord going to contribute financially? The base rent. If it's $20 per square foot, can you get that down to 15 or 18? The lease term. 3 months rent. So it is not unusual to ask for and get several months up front free. Why would you do that? Because it takes time for a business to gain traction. I will tell you that there is no such thing as a free lunch, right? So if the landlord gives you 3 months free, that 5-year lease term, which is 60 months, now turns into 63 months. I guarantee it. Okay, they're going to get their 5 years out of you. Okay, so ask for as much as you want, but those free months will be added on to the end of that lease term. HVAC install or other large ticket items. And this will be determined by the kind of space and what you want to do with it. Okay, so if it's a matter of a restaurateur wanting to open up their business and they're like, I really want to pull the trigger on this, but the way the ventilation needs to be is going to cost me $50,000. If the landlord can cover that, I'll sign today. So some of those big ticket items. Okay, so move in. All new commercial tenants will need to get a new certificate of occupancy from the town. So it's similar to when a residential client moves into a new construction home. They got to get they call it a CO, certificate of occupancy. And whether it was, let's take the dentist office as an example. Doesn't matter if it was a dentist office before, and it still is, you still need a new certificate of occupancy. Why is that? I'm going to give you an uh-oh moment that actually turned out well, but it showed my inexperience. That church that I told you earlier that I mentioned went into a strip center, and it was a fair amount of space, no doubt about it. But it was a workout studio before. It was a gym, so lots of open space. The pastor went in and remodeled it and made offices and rooms and so on. And it came time to do the certificate of occupancy. And the town, every town, has restrictions on the maximum capacity of people that can be in that space. So he was renting out the exact same square footage as the gym was. The gym's requirement was 35 people max could be in that space. And so I was panicking. Now, the pastor and I knew people in the town and was able to make a quick phone call and say, please tell me that the maximum occupancy is not going to be 35 people. And it was not. And the lesson learned for me and y'all is that the maximum occupancy is dependent upon what you're using it for. So the same 2,500 square feet as a gym was 35 people max. The church was like 200 people. It was well above whatever it was going to be. So just FYI. Utilities need to be coordinated. And then don't forget the signage. So this kind of came back to bite me too a little bit because it's just so expensive. So a sign can be $6,000. And when you're writing checks to contractors for $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, the last thing you want to do is buy a sign. The issue is that you can put up the sign before you're open. And in fact, that's advisable. I didn't know that. So I used it. I did this the last thing because you want to generate interest even while you're still getting ready to open. So don't forget the signage. All right, so let's look at a contract. I got 20 minutes. And let's look at the letter of intent. So the good thing about Texas realtors and just the state of Texas in general is that they have forms for this stuff. You can have a lawyer do this, but I think by and large you're covered. I have actually added on an addendum at the end to cover things that I've just come in contact with. So this is your non-binding, here's what I want as a tenant. Okay, so here we go. Your term, this is the grid for how much you're going to pay. Okay, so we're going to go through an exercise with this in a moment. But here's where you get down to the additional rent. Okay, wherever it mentions taxes, insurance, CAM, common area maintenance. Up here, base rent. And you want it reflected as monthly, as annual, and then what the base monthly rent is going to be. Sorry, this is per square foot over here. Per square foot per month, annual rate per square foot and per year, and then what the check's going to be written for. Then you come down here and you got to enter in all this stuff, which is how much are you going to pay? Okay, so whenever they mention pro rata share, that means if you have 2,400 square feet and 100,000 square foot strip center, you're only going to pay your portion of that. So let's take, because this is kind of the meat of what you'll do as a realtor, I've drafted up an example of what that looks like. All right, so let's say your tenant is renting 5,000 square foot piece of space, and it's going to be at $12 per square foot. So as opposed to a residential calculation, you're going to do this calculation and you're going to come up with a big fat number. And that's going to be $60,000 as an annual number. You then need to divide that by 12 months, and they're going to pay $5,000 per month in base rent. And so let's say you've negotiated 3 months for free. You're going to put in 0. I'll go back to the form in a moment. But then let's say beginning April 1 through that next year, it's going to be $5,000. Well, guess what? That rent's going to go up each year. It's about 3%. So I'm going to tack on $5,150 to $5,000 for the next year. And then guess what? 3% on top of that $5,150 goes to the next year. So on a monthly basis, it doesn't sting as much. But again, it is something that the tenant may not be aware of. So let's look at the triple net calculations. This is going to cover your taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance for your landlord. Same equation, 5,000 square feet of space, and the triple nets are usually much less than the base rent. Let's say they're $6. That's going to be $30,000 annually, though. That's going to be an extra $2,500 a month. So your total monthly rent commitment is going to be $7,500. How many donuts are you going to need to sell to cover that rent? And I mean, I say this tongue in cheek, but you know, what's a donut cost? 69 cents? I don't know. That is 11,000 donuts a month. Divided by 30 days, that's 366 donuts a day they have to sell. That's real life. So that doesn't include their insurance, their cost to make the donuts, payroll. So you can kind of see where this equation gets unreachable for a lot of small businesses. Okay. But I will guarantee that your tenants have not done this math. They just want to wing it and hope that it works out.
Hey, Brad.
Yes.
So is this typical, this example you're using for a donut shop? Do they always use the triple net?
They do.
Okay.
They do because, Mark, normally they're in a strip center. Now, you could be real entrepreneurial and know that making donuts is your lifelong calling, and you can go build something freestanding and own it. But the rent, I mean, now that you're the owner, you're still on the hook for those taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance. So you're still paying it. You're just not paying it to the landlord because you're the landlord.
Right.
You know?
Would this be the same for like retail? Because typically you would see a percentage, right?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you mean percentage of the sales, but Mark so Mark brings up a good point, and I wasn't going to cover this today, but in the lease, if it's a business such that you can get a break in the rent, but you then agree to pay the landlord a percentage of sales, that is 100% what goes on. So maybe you pay half of what my example is, but you agree to pay the landlord 5% of the profits every month. And, you know, I mean, that could be a risk for the landlord too. I mean, maybe some months you make nothing, but that could be part of the negotiation. Yep. And then, you know, lastly, I'll just mention that the rent, I mean, this is going to fluctuate because the taxes go up, the insurance goes up, and so on. Okay, so back to the LOI. We talked about triple nets. Renewal option. Okay, so renewal option and tenants use are a big deal because you can just gloss over this and think that, well, yeah, whatever, if it's a donut shop, it's always going to be a donut shop. Well, maybe not. So let's talk about renewal. Most realtors put in here, tenant reserves the right to renew this lease upon expiration at the market rent. Bad idea, because the market rent 5 years from now is not going to be what it is today. So a good commercial practitioner is going to put in there not to exceed 3% of what the rent is at the end of 5 years, or 5% of what it is today. Lock that baby in. Moving on to the tenant's use. If you're opening up, Sandy, I'll use your example. If you open up a dog grooming business and that's all you want to do, dogs are coming in, dogs are going out, no pets are staying on the premises. 2 years in, you realize, you know what? I could make a ton more money if I boarded these animals. And you want to use it as a boarding facility now. And that means, think about that. That means that staff is going to have to come by and walk these dogs. And a certain amount of more care and business attentiveness is going to have to be deployed if that change takes place. You want to account for that under tenant use. What it is today may not be what it's going to be 5 years from now, even if it is not a thought in that tenant's mind. The biggest issues arise when it's a restaurant and want to start serving alcohol. Okay, so start planting those seeds in your tenant's mind in terms of growth. What's that going to look like 3, 5, 10 years down the road? You're going to want to account for that, because largely a landlord's not going to care until you do it and don't tell them. Then they're going to care a lot. Okay, tenant improvements. Again, is the landlord going to pony up? What does that look like? Okay, and then this is crossroads number one, where you're going to say, hey, wait a second, this tenant is being represented. I expect to get paid. And then, then you're going to put in here how you're going to get paid. Now, I will tell you, and I haven't mentioned this yet, please listen. It is not uncommon for the landlord to not pay you. So you're going to have to get that from your tenant. Okay, now sometimes they will, but you want to make sure that before you go down that road, that the tenant understands that in my first example, they may be on the hook for $14,000. And this is one area where you don't want to do this for free. This is not, oh, a lease is going to turn into a buyer and I'm only going to take $25. Don't do that. But you got to understand up front who's paying your fee. It is not uncommon for the landlord to not pay your fee. All right. And in big, bold capital letters is where it explains that it is not binding. And then it is not uncommon to put an expiration date. Okay, here's my LOI. Think about it. Don't take too long. We're moving on. Here's the addendum that I put on when I talk about pylons and signage and exclusivity. Okay, if I'm a real estate office in a strip center, Mr. and Mrs. Landlord, you better not let Century 21 move in next door to me. Don't want that going on. Okay, build out, what does that look like? TI allowance. The other thing is the location. So a lot of these strip centers have frontage view, but then they have another strip center behind it that no one knows exists. And if that's the only location that you can take, you better account for that in the rent. And then first right of refusal. So if your lease expires and you want to move up closer, you want to be offered that space first. Okay. All right. So let's power through. Are you going to love that story? The Great Flood. Stand by. This is the broker fee announcement. This is where you send in with your LOI. Hey, I'm a realtor. I want to get paid 4%. And this is not, don't think that you're breaching protocol here. They know that you expect to be paid. You just want to know how. Okay. But all this is to say that this is the document you use to get paid. So let's talk about the lease. Okay. So here's the leased premises. A lot of times it's referred to as the demised premises. Okay, lease term, delay of occupancy. If tenant is unable to occupy the leased premises on the commencement date, and commencement date is huge, that's when the clock starts ticking. If you can't move in though, this paragraph says landlord's not on the hook for anything. Okay, and that's common. You're building out, you know, you're trying to get supplies in there. You can't be open for business until a certain date. Certificate of occupancy, it says in big letters here, tenant's responsible. Average tenant doesn't realize that. Then here's the grid that I mentioned. So from to, that's going to be free in my example. From to, April 1, March 31, $5,000, and so on. And then here's the additional rents. This is the contract. This is the lease. This is no longer the LOI. Come on. There we go. All right. And then tenant's pro rata share is, that's for the landlord to fill in. Maybe you're on the hook for 8% of the taxes, insurance, all that good stuff. And then it explains what CAM means, what insurance means, what taxes means. As new commercial practitioners, a lot of your questions will be answered in these contracts. Take the time to read them. Okay, base year expenses. Who's going to pay it? You know, so basically as a tenant, you're worried about what my rent is going to be and what I'm on the hook for triple net. Okay, that's what you're looking to vet out. Okay, by law, reconciliation. 120 days after each calendar year. This is extremely important as it pertains to triple nets. January 1 will roll around. They're going to get a new tax bill, and they're going to get a new estimate as to what the taxes will be for that upcoming year. They have 120 days to reconcile what they collected from you as a tenant, match that up with what the taxes and insurance were, refund you any money that they overcollected for, and then say, oh, by the way, we estimate those taxes and insurance to be this amount for the year that you're now in, and your rent will be reflective of that. Okay, so you as a tenant are owed that disclosure, and they have 120 days from January 1 to do it. Security deposit, taxes, let's gloss over that. Utilities, who's paying for this? In a strip center situation, typically water is covered, but don't assume. Everything else is covered by the tenant. You know, I mean, sewer, not, right? I mean, if you're on city sewer, no, but electric, gas, telephone, internet, cable, even trash pickup sometimes. Okay, even trash pickup, especially if you're a restaurant. I had a Fuzzy's Taco that was next door to me, and they have these cooking oil receptacles. If you are a restaurant and you need that, the landlord ain't paying for that. You are paying for that. That's why there's an option 9 and you leave it blank. Okay, don't leave anything to chance. Okay, after hours HVAC charges. This is my one comment about high-rise leases. That big tall building I showed you earlier, think about the last time you went into your doctor's office and they were in a 20-story building. They are not open on the weekends. That HVAC is not being run on the weekend. So if you are in a high-rise, paragraph D talks about what happens to the HVAC. So think about this for a CPA. During tax time, you're there on the weekends. So you need to understand if the HVAC is being run and what other things you're not going to have access to. And these boxes speak to that. Insurance, you will have to have liability. And in this particular lease, it spells out how much you need to have. Okay. The property insurance is going to cover fire, flood. What they're talking about here is if someone has an accident inside your office or outside on the sidewalk. A tenant may use the leased premises during the following hours. That's pretty basic. Hazardous materials. If there's anything that's going to be stored on the property that is owned by the landlord, got to disclose. That cooking oil falls under that category. Signage, you're going to be relegated to what the city ordinances are. But my landlord was very insistent that the sign stayed on, so that, meaning lit up, so that when the sun went down, his multi-million-dollar strip center looked like it was the happening place. So make sure you understand those types of things. Access by the landlord, they can get in there, same as a rental property. I will tell you this just happened to a commercial agent of mine. You can lock someone out, okay? And it says that in here somewhere. Yeah, so if the tenant defaults on their lease or doesn't pay the rent, they will be locked out. And the landlord does not have to let them back in to get their stuff. That becomes property of the landlord. So again, don't think that you can abandon your lease. Repairs and maintenance. This is why I know so much about commercial leasing. This lease doesn't even begin to cover what a typical legally drafted commercial lease covers when it comes to maintenance and repairs. Typically, there is language in there where if your unit floods or catches fire or there's some kind of disaster, the landlord doesn't cover it. Okay, if someone plugs up a toilet and that runs for a day and water destroys your unit and the 2 units next to you, that is not the landlord's problem. That happened to me. Okay, and I got a quick lesson in what the lease covered and what it didn't when that happened. All right, so be very careful. And if you want to negotiate, then I would look at the lease based on the age of the building. Okay, because anything can happen. Okay, but it's very important to understand who's covering what. And I'm going to show you what the result of that was. And I apologize for running over. I'm not going to go too much longer. But this is just another list of who covers what in terms of repair. The tenant is pretty much responsible for a lot of this. Fire protection equipment. This is another nice little bill you'll have to pay. Every year, the town has to come in and inspect for fire codes. That's about $100. He shows up and you don't realize he ain't leaving without a check. Sprinkler system, same way. Glass and windows. I negotiated this because they're expensive. If someone ruins your plate glass window, you know how expensive that is to repair, not to mention the exposure you have if there's just a piece of plywood there. So landlord agreed to cover that, knowing that that never happened, but it does happen. Break-ins happen all the time. Okay, HVAC service contract. Who's covering for the maintenance? Spoiler alert, you are. You are. Liens and liability, this just goes to reiterate that if there is a default, the landlord can take possession, and they will. There we go, default. Landlord will take possession of the property, lock you out, and everything within inside the lease premises is his or hers. Why? Because they've got to cover their rent. They've got to cover their rent. Okay. Pretty much it. You can't sublease it. Typically, estoppel certificate means that you're no longer financially liable to the landlord for any kind of tenant improvements, things like that. Casualty loss, same thing. You know, yada yada yada. Right. So, but this is only a fraction of, it probably only covers 65% of what a normal lawyer written lease will cover. So on to my show and tell. This is it for my presentation, but you guys will appreciate this. So 4th of July, 2020, I think was on a Saturday. And so I left on, and Friday was the holiday. And so I left on a Thursday thinking that I was going to return on Monday. And this left picture was what I drove up to on a Saturday, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, after one of the realtors walked in and said, "Have you been up to the office lately?" No, and it's a 40-minute drive. What's going on? I think you need to come up here. This is what I drove up to. If there's enough water in any space where it's flowing out the front door, you've got issues. The second two pictures are what was inside. The reflection of the lights are seen in the 3 inches of water that accumulated in the 2,400 square feet of office space. There wasn't 1 square inch that was spared. Someone had, and this is combo driven, you may be able to see here in the left-hand picture, this little rectangle here, that's a combo. So instead of giving a realtor a key, they were able to go in there, whatever. So someone went in there to use the restroom, flushed the toilet, left, thinking that what could possibly go wrong. We think that it was the toilet that just kind of got stuck and overflowed for who knows, day, you know. And the, is this it? Yeah. So this was the second of 3 times the office flooded. This was by far the worst. The first and third time were pretty bad, but not as bad as this. And so I am calling the leasing company, screaming holy hell at them because it's their fault. And why aren't you covering this? And on a holiday weekend. And so they sent over a water remediation company, sopped up all the water, was there for hours into the night, tore up the carpet, and everything that, you know, comes along with water damage. And then came time to pay the people that did this. And I'm like, well, aren't you covering this? No. Look at your lease. And sure enough, the lease said it did not cover repairs to or damage caused by plumbing, either externally, the pipes externally exposed you could see, or internally concealed as in the slab. And the first and third flood was a result of leaks in the slab. This is a 40-year-old building. And I sure as heck didn't think to address this. Even if someone had brought it to my attention, I would have said, what are the odds? Turns out the odds were pretty good. $25,000 to just get the water removed. Another 7 or 8 to do other stuff, put the baseboards back on, and just generally put it all back together. Not to mention furniture was ruined. Had a title company in there at that time. Documents were left on the floor. They were ruined. Insurance covered $25,000 of it. I was on the hook for 10. Insurance got canceled. To re-up my insurance, it was $800 a year that I was paying, went up to $3,000. And it was just an absolute disaster. This was after I had claimed a $4,000 repair to a brand new HVAC system that the landlord agreed to put in there for me. But I had to, if the insurance company didn't pay for it, I was on the hook for it. So these are just examples of business ending expenses that come up, that absolutely come up, that need to be considered. These lights that you see reflections of, I had to call an electrician out probably 8 times and have them replaced because they just wear out. And you know, I used to kid people and say, I mean, this is ridiculous. I'm just in here pushing paper, tapping on computer keys. I mean, what are the odds of the toilet not flushing correctly? What are the odds of a pipe getting a pinhole hole in it underneath the slab and the water starts coming up through the concrete? That happened to me twice. And so again, these are business ending catastrophes that need to be talked about before. And this goes hand in hand with what are you doing in the space? You know, and by the way, the reason why the lease doesn't cover this is because people are jackhammering into the foundation when you sign this lease. So when I had to get this reconfigured, and it was a shell, and even if it weren't, you're moving plumbing around. And I have contractors jackhammering into the foundation and moving plumbing around. And so naturally a landlord is not going to want to take responsibility for that. That is why it's not covered, by the way. And I learned that the hard way because it was no different for me. Contractor jackhammered into the foundation because the bathrooms needed to be here and they were over here. And so that's why it's not covered. Doesn't mean you don't try and push for coverage or get extra flood coverage or whatever. Luckily, it didn't go into any of the spots next door, but that's my graphic illustration. That's why I know so much about the commercial leasing process. And I genuinely want to help other people not get into this situation. Because man, I was fit to be tied, as you can imagine. So I know Brad, I went a little over. Any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Brad, I might have been on a phone call. You might have already covered this, but what's the typical due diligence period for a commercial, when you're looking at a commercial property, looking at leasing one?
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't cover that, and I think that it's less than when you buy it. But I would say a good 30 days. And so what Jeff is really referring to is that when you sign that LOI, that's baked in there. Like here's what I want, but I want 30 days to figure out if I can do with it what I want to do with it. And so I would say 30 days.
Yeah, because I could think, especially on a second gen, I mean, you want to make sure they didn't put in cheap stuff and all that. I mean, that's definitely, I've seen a lot of people get burned on that, renting a commercial space, and the guy before them put in just a super cheap HVAC system that breaks down all the time. And
great example. Yep. And the HVAC is going to be your highest ticket item in that space, by the way, because it's going to break just like they do in our home.
Brad, I have a couple of questions.
Yep.
I have an opportunity to represent a landlord. It's like a mom and pop that owns a commercial building. And I've been talking to them. Their current tenant is going to leave maybe within the next year or so. And they are considering going in, and the landlord is considering going in and revamping the office. And I am kind of the persuasion that they should not do that. It should probably just leave it as is. What's the opinion about whether or not a landlord should make improvements prior to, between tenants prior to release? Because what if they have a new tenant that wants to come in and make it their own?
And they will. And so I think that if there's deficient plumbing and HVAC and structural things, go for it. Because those are going to just make it that more attractive. But I wouldn't start building walls and creating a space that is only going to be good for one particular tenant.
Okay, that's what they were thinking it would look better to show, and I was trying to let them know, not necessarily.
Yeah, it's the opposite of what you would think for a residential piece of property.
Okay.
That could detract from it.
The other question, if the MLS doesn't have a lot of these properties in there, how do we know what is a good market price per square foot? Where do we get that information?
Yeah, great question. So there is no repository where you're going to get past leased information, or for that matter, what something sold for. The best rule of thumb is that developers and landlords want space leased. So they're going to advertise what a market rent rate is going to be. So the best place to look is what's currently leasing right now, and assume that is the high end. So if someone puts in LoopNet that it's $26 a square foot, know that you might be able to get that down to 20, 21, 22, maybe, but
Okay.
that's going to be in the ballpark of what the market rent is.
Okay, and then on the other side of that, if we're representing a tenant and they want to go into a place, for example, I have a client who is a tenant in a strip with a nail salon. So she's complaining about her lease being too high. When it comes up for renewal, would they allow her to be represented by a realtor to negotiate the renewal? Is that something that is done or not?
That is such a great question. The answer is yes.
Okay.
And now you likely won't get compensated by the landlord, but is it worth $5,000 to the tenant to get, $1,000 a month knocked off the rent? Absolutely.
Okay. So
People have asked me that before.
If they send her a renewal, she should maybe just not do anything until her realtor can help her negotiate that. And then,
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Anything else? Any other comments or input? Okay. Well, again, if this piques your interest, please research what other classes you can take about commercial leasing. And if you want to have another conversation with me about it, I am more than open to doing that. But hopefully, if nothing else, you will look at a mom and pop business either coming or going in a little bit different light, because as the saying goes, the struggle is real. Struggle is real. It takes a lot to build and sustain a small business in this country. So anyway, thank you. And we will see you guys. So next week is our CE, and I'll send out a flyer for that in terms of what that is, how to pay and all that good stuff. But, same time, same place. So thank you guys. We'll see you then.